have you heard about John Cena with the little controversy over a statement he made doing promotion for Fast and Furious 9?
No, it's not something that I'm personally into, but I have heard about, of course, a lot about Fast and Furious. What did he say?
He talked about how excited he was, referring to Taiwan as a country instead of a city, and because of the way that city is being viewed in a city and not wanting to offend the Chinese government, he had to quickly go on and apologize about the reference because there's political issues involved with that.
Yes, I can see that. The situation with issues like Taiwan is very complex. And despite the political issues, there's actually a lot of cultural exchange between Taiwan and the mainland. For example, in the film industry, a lot of the expertise of directors and actors are recruited in mainland productions, and in Taiwan, they're very big on traditional culture, and that is essentially traditional Chinese culture, promoting that in things like tourism and the arts. I hope that people can look beyond that, beyond the political disputes, which are very complex in itself.
From Geppetto Studios in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, welcome to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, your home for inclusive, positive geek culture, where we talk about movies, comics, music, books, and whatever else we feel like. Please welcome your host,
He can generate kitties on demand,
Brad Mendenhall.
Hey kids, it is episode 236 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. It's a great one as new friend Xueting Ni makes her debut to talk about the interaction of American and Asian pop culture. I was very excited to have Xueting, but was worried I was going to butcher her name. I barely get mine right. But she said I did a good job, and she is a delight. Anywho, Katie has a question.
What side character do you wish you knew more about?
I love this question. This is a fantastic question. I'm going to give an answer that I think Katie will really appreciate. Hermione Granger. She was in the Harry Potter universe. She was the main trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Hermione was the smartest and I think had the most interesting backstory. She was a wizard with Muggle, non-wizard parents, and I think that's a really interesting story. And I think you could have a lot of neat side adventures with that character, and because sort of being in both worlds, and also the fact that she was the smartest, she was the hardest to study, but you saw a little bit in the movies and a little bit in the books. She wasn't the most naturally gifted at wizarding, and I think that makes an interesting story. This girl who is very smart, very dedicated, a hard study, who doesn't take to these things as well as the people who are the 5th or 100th or however many generation in that world. And I think that would make a great story.
Very excited, making her Cosmic Geppetto debut, writer, pop culture expert, self-professed geek, and I'm going to just butcher her name, Xueting Ni. How did I do? Did I do okay?
You did absolutely fantastic.
Good. I barely get my own name right often when I'm announcing this. So I'm glad I got yours. So excited to have you on the show, and some really cool stuff to talk about.
Thank you, Brad. It's fantastic to be here. I'm excited to be on your show.
You know a lot about Chinese pop culture and sort of the interaction between American pop culture and Chinese pop culture. And I'm fascinated by it because China is the second biggest consumer of pop culture, of movies, and has become very important to the point where some movies can't have success because budgets are so big. They can't be successful financially just based on US box office. And you have cases of some movies where, thinking specifically of Ghostbusters Afterlife, the 2016 Ghostbusters movie that had middling success in the States, but because of some rules about cinema, wasn't able to open in China. And a lot of people believe that because they weren't able to get that big box office in China, that was the reason why that movie ended up being a money loser.
China is certainly going through a golden age right now in cinema. A lot of multiplexes have been built with multiple screens that need to be filled with movies. A lot of these are domestic productions which have really grown over the last 10 to 20 years, but some of it will be foreign blockbusters. Now, there's a quota that the China Film Group sets every year. I think it's about 30, or it might be slightly more now, of foreign films that they'll import every year. So it is a limited number. So there are films that will be selected and there are films that won't be selected. But yes, China is a huge market for its own movies and also domestic movies. It's a huge country and it has a huge population who are all going to these fancy new cinemas.
Preparing for our conversation, I looked up 50 highest grossing movies in China of all time. There are plenty of US created movies, Avengers Endgame, Fast and Furious 7, but they're also the number listed as the number one grossing movie in China was Wolf Warrior 2.
Yeah.
I've never heard of this movie. It's something very interesting how U.S. movies, Avengers and Fast and Furious, a lot of big tentpole movies, Aquaman, make their way over to China. They haven't yet had. There hasn't been yet a big example of the reverse happening. A movie that's really successful in China coming over to States and achieving significant box office. There have been some directors, and not just China, but all over the world, who have their international success and then come to the States. Is there one blockbuster Chinese movie you thought could have done really well in the States?
The first thing that comes to my mind is Wandering Earth, the adaptation of the Liu Cixin science fiction story. That came out in 2019, and I believe it had a very good global reception. The Chinese movie industry has really been revamped since the early 2000s, when China joined the WTO and allowed foreign films into the market. At first, they found themselves having to compete and unable to with foreign films because the output, volume, and quality was not really up to standard, and they've really had to learn a lot over the last 20 years or so. Now, so there's been more investment, more nurturing of talent, and more sort of building of Chinese film studios. Now, I can say that a lot of China's output is a much higher standard. It's also focused more on bringing its films to the world, international releases. Although the interesting thing is that at the moment, its domestic market, right now, unlike before, its domestic market is fulfilling a lot of demand. All sorts of films, whether it's comedy, social drama, or something catered to domestic tastes, or kind of action films, thrillers, genre movies. It doesn't really need to prioritize a lot exporting its films. So perhaps that's why we're not seeing a huge push from China to export its films. It's getting a lot of fulfilling of demand and box office numbers from its own market. But I think it's a great shame because there is such great output from China at the moment that I think would be great to share with Western audiences. An example of a great success. It was the first time that people noticed a sci-fi blockbuster from China, although by no means It's by no means one of the first Chinese sci-fi films, and that is a tradition that's happened since the 20th century. Earlier, if you look at the writing. So, am I going on a bit too much?
No. I'm really interested because I'm so interested to hear this perspective. Because you've studied this a lot better than I have. It's a lot deeper and more complicated than you realize. Up to this point, Chinese or any Asian centric filmmaking, you would think of karate movies.
Yes, kung fu films.
I remember watching those growing up, and the stunt work was always amazing, but the special effects and everything else in the writing and everything around them, and they might have been either they were very basic or very simple, or the translation coming over was so simplified. And it would become a thing of, it's like, okay, are we getting just a very boulderized, simplistic version of what's come through? You would see with animation that would be coming over from the East. I'm watching Trans or Z or Star Blazers or whatever that had their origins in Asia, and they were much more adult, much smarter, much more complex. But because they were adult, they would have to be basically neutered, and then fed to children, which isn't where the intention was. The world's gotten smaller in a lot of ways. It feels like it's just a matter of time before something breaks through, because we already had, especially directors, John Woo, Ang Lee, who've come over and had a lot of success in the States, both with their original content. John Woo's original movies, Hard Boiled, I'm thinking of, had a great following in the States, but still nothing with that big box office. People go to see it in theaters.
So, first of all, about the kung fu films, as you say, karate films or kung fu films. There was a huge wave of kung fu films that entered the US around the 1970s. And I think that set a lot of people's interest. That began a lot of people's interest in kung fu fantasy films and kung fu movies. A lot of them who are watching things like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Hero, or Ip Man, all of these newer kung fu films, or Kung Fu Hero, Tai Chi Zero, they still remember those films. A lot of them were made by the Shaw Studios, who were dubbing them at the same time and exporting them. Initially, it is in the area of kung fu films that this is a window through which the West saw China, but now it's no longer the case. There are a lot of kind of dark social comedies, some action films, some historical epics that are also released in West. Wandering Earth. Have you seen Wandering Earth? And I think it came out in cinemas over in the US. Of course, it got a Netflix release.
I wasn't aware of it until it started getting some buzz on Netflix. It did get some release in US theaters, but it would be released at art houses.
Oh, I see. That's interesting.
Which isn't uncommon. Got a little bit of buzz from the positive buzz it got from it, and then it made its way onto Netflix. And Netflix is great because it gives people an opportunity to see television programs and films that you wouldn't normally get to see because it's on Netflix, and they have a great cultural breadth.
Yeah, that's a great thing about Netflix. They source films from all around the world in all types of films and TV series.
It also, though, ends up being the disadvantage because there's so much content.
Yes.
It ends up very easy for these films to get lost. Me and my frequent co-host Jarf Harden will actually have even done a somewhat recurring segment where it's like Crossing the Streams, where we just talk about little things that you become aware of or that are on the different streaming services, and that's how I became aware of Ip Man.
That's had about 4 films now. They're all distinct in their own ways. I think the whole Wing Chun school of Kung Fu and Ip Man as an iconic figure has inspired a lot of different types of films, biopics, Kung Fu films, etc. Superhero films even. There was a film starring Donnie Yen on Netflix, based on Chen Zhen, who was a real person that lived in early 20th century China, and it's set around that time. And he, at one point, he dons a superhero suit with a mask, and he's fighting like a superhero, but with kung fu. I forget the name of it. Shall I look it up quickly? Fist of Fury. So anyway, so you became aware of Ip Man. Did you watch the films? What did you think of the films?
Yeah, yeah. Donnie Chen's amazing. Similar to Jackie Chan 30 years ago, he's one of these actors that American culture and American filmmakers have been interested in a long time, but they haven't really always figured out a way to really bring him over to the States permanently. But he's had work. I mean, he's worked in the States. He's found work in the States for years. Like going back, like 2003, he was in, or 2002, he was in the second Blade movie. He was in Shanghai Nights.
Yes, he's had that crossover. He's crossed over slightly from Hong Kong cinema into Hollywood cinema, I guess.
Am I remembering right? He fought in one of, I think it was one of the Ip Man movies. He fought Mike Tyson.
Ah, interesting. I've seen the first one only of the Ip Man movies. The film I was talking about is called Legend of the Fist: The Return of Chen Jin.
Yeah, from 2010. It's amazing. We always think, and it's a failure of American culture. We always think these people are brand new and fresh faced, and no, Donnie Chen has been acting for decades.
That's right, yes. In fact, he spent a lot of time, he lived in Canada for a long time. Yeah, so he's like actually Canadian Chinese, I believe. Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head that there aren't enough movies or works from the East in the West. We're always having this issue of cultural representation, which I think has improved a lot over the last decade or so, though, and will continue to, hopefully.
They just, not too long ago, Marvel released the first trailer for Shang-Chi, which is going to be the first movie starring a.
It's very exciting.
And it looks so cool, and it looks like a really good movie, and they're throwing a ton of money at it. I've read the old Shang-Chi comics. You know, in the comics, he was the lone Asian in the comics, or it was him and an Asian bad guy, and then all the other many of the supporting characters would be Caucasian, because these books were written by Caucasians, and that caused two problems. First, they definitely didn't know how to write an Asian dynamic, and then second, the dialogue that Shang-Chi, the master of Kung Fu, pretty much everything they had him say would sound like basically something that they just ripped off from the nearest fortune cookie.
Yes, nobody talks like that in real life, that's true.
And on one hand, you want to give a certain amount of credit because at least there was an Asian character in this comic. So, okay, that's better than just another blue-eyed, blonde, white guy as a center character. But it would have been very nice if they could have gotten some representation creatively as well as being the main character of the story. But with the movie Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings, looks amazing. The money's on. What was it? Henry Golding is the star. Because I'm just blanking on names like crazy today. He is a charismatic, athletic guy, and I think people are really excited. And this could launch him into a completely different stratosphere of stardom.
Yeah, it's very different from Crazy Rich Asians. So which role is he playing? I mean, I'm very aware that Tony Leung is playing the Mandarin. There is Simu Liu as Shang-Chi himself and Awkwafina, but not totally.
Oh, I might be wrong on that. I might have gotten Henry Golding is doing something else. He's doing something else cool because it's Simu Liu as Shang-Chi.
Yeah, I'm sure he's doing something else, possibly another superhero movie.
Oh no, he's going to be in Snake Eyes. Snake Eyes.
Oh,
which is very exciting. That's the G.I. Joe character.
right. Yes, the villain, right?
No, he is going to be Snake Eyes. Henry Golding is going to be in the Snake Eyes film, the spinoff of G.I. Joe.
That's very cool.
It's very cool, especially because Snake Eyes was part of a very tired trope in the comics where he was a white guy who was taken in by an Asian group and becomes like the best kung fu fighter. It's a thing that there was a lot of complaints about recently, rightfully, with the Iron Fist TV show.
Yes, I thought of Iron Fist when you started talking about his backstory. Yeah, Iron Fist is exactly like that. Taken in by a group of Asian, actually a celestial race with a lot of Asian cultural characteristics, and he becomes the best fighter in the whole universe. So now he's having some sort of they're reinterpreting this character.
The Snake Eyes, the GI Joe character, they decided, and I think it's a great idea, that he's a character who's always been masked. Was portrayed by Ray Park, but he was a character who didn't talk, who was always covered in a mask. So Ray Park, a very good stuntman, it made sense. But they're giving Snake Eyes his own movie. They decided, let's get this great-looking Asian actor to play it, and which is great because
Yeah, he occupies an interesting space because he's, I think, mixed race. So that's an interesting cultural space between East and West.
so important because there's been very, very few A-list leading man or leading woman Asian actors ever. You think of Bruce Lee. Even Bruce Lee was sort of a B movie actor who really achieved his huge success in the States after he passed away.
Yes, unfortunately, it was so young before he could make any more great films, such as, like Enter the Dragon in those times in the 60s, 70s. It was a lot less socially acceptable internationally to have people of color as take main roles in productions. I think that's improved a lot. There is still a lot of room for improvement.
It's so slow for there to be change. It's been especially slow for Asian culture. Even in the States, and there's been plenty of cultural problems with the treatment of African American actors and characters, but you still have had Sidney Poitier, Will Smith, Denzel Washington, Chadwick Boseman a little more recently, Michael B. Jordan now. Black actors who've been able to sort of transcend those issues and have had solid careers as leading men. When it comes to actors of Asian descent, been so few and they seem to only get so many chances of success. Jackie Chan took him so long to break through, and then he finally did. But even then, there seems to be a real limitation on what movies he can star in. They always tend to be pretty small budget. I just recently saw pop up some story about Jason Scott Lee, who played Bruce Lee in Dragon the Bruce Lee story. Very good actor, great looking guy, athletic, and could do action very well, but had dramatic chops and decent comedy chops. But he got the Dragon the Bruce Lee story. Then he did Jungle Book, which was fairly successful, and he was very good in it. And then he was in a movie, Rapa Nui. I'm butchering the name of that. That wasn't successful. And then that was it. All of a sudden, his chances of being a movie leading man dried up immediately. Like there's so few chances to break through. And meanwhile, Ryan Reynolds, and I like Ryan Reynolds, has just a string of bombs in his background, but still kept getting more chances.
There's a general global movement towards diversity at all levels of society, whether it's companies or in the arts, that's beginning. Hopefully, we'll see some more change from that. It is particularly tough for Asian actors and actresses, I think, to make it into mainstream Anglophone cinema, I suppose. But we've had films like Rebels, where we had Donnie Yen and Jiang Wen as two main characters. And I think that's an important moment. They become very popular characters. Donnie Yen playing the sort of characters that he usually does. He does very well, the Kung Fu, master of Kung Fu, highly trained swordsman, and Jiang Wen slightly stepping outside perhaps of his usual roles in kind of more drama type films into an action hero. So we are getting more, but there should be a lot more, as you say. And going back to the point that you were making before about superheroes from like maybe the Silver Age or Bronze Age, Silver Age comics, like Iron Fist and Shang-Chi, who were problematic in their representation from a cultural perspective, in that there was a lot of dodgy representation and cultural appropriation, but at the same time, these characters were created, especially Iron Fist. He was created out of a lot of love for martial arts and kung fu. The original creators, Roy Thomas and Gil Kane, and also Harry Harmer, pencilers and the writers, they really loved their kung fu movies, and one of them was an enthusiastic kung fu gymnast. So it was born out of their love for the practice and the genre, and it showed in the early comics. And of course, and Shang-Chi was very problematic in his origins. The original few issues, I had to read them for research, but there were lots of kind of racist text in the first few issues, and he was, of course, the son of Fu Manchu, who was a racial stereotype that came out of the late 19th, early 20th century, Yellow Peril, etc. However, in the 90s, he got this huge revamp, and he's done so much in the Marvel Universe. He's fought with the Avengers, with Heroes for Hire. He's taught Spider-Man Kung Fu, just to mention a few of the cool things he's done. So they've had they had decades of life in Marvel, and they've not remained, I mean, they've developed a lot through these decades. I'm really glad that they exist because they put Kung Fu in the canon of Marvel.
The relatively recent plot line where Spider-Man lost his spider sense and needed to learn how to fight without it, so they developed the way of the spider because Shang-Chi is viewed as, and basically is stated, he is the best unarmed fighter in the Marvel universe. So he's basically Marvel's equivalent to, like, Batman is the same way in DC.
As in a non-mutant who just relies on his fighting skills.
And it's very cool, just a guy with his fists in his feet being able to fight alongside Thor and Captain America and Spider-Man. That's pretty darn cool.
Yeah, I mean, his superpower is his kung fu skills, basically. You can call it harnessing of the cosmic force or chi-based power. It is through years of hard training, and sometimes it manifests in superhuman format, but it's basically his training. But there is also, I think, an uprightness to Shang-Chi and an honorable nature that's part of the wuxia swordsman. Wuxia being the Chinese word for kung fu fantasy. So he's pretty cool as a character who has no superpowers as such.
One thing I want to talk about, briefly mentioned, is that it was in Ip Man 3, Mike Tyson, former boxing heavyweight champion of the world, had I think basically a glorified cameo where him and Donnie Chen duked it out and I remember the scene. Basically, Johnny Chen's character wanted information from Mike Tyson, and he said, well, if you can survive a fight with me for 3 minutes, I'll give you the information. And they have this fight. There's something that's happened, I want to say in the last 10 years, it's become more and more common where actors who were pretty big names in the States making their way over to China and doing movies, and often they are cameos or they're supporting roles, and I think collecting a pretty nice paycheck for it. I'm curious. I know Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was it was called Iron Mask in the States. It was a Jackie Chan movie, and I don't know how to pronounce it. VIY2, Journey to China.
That sounds like it could be a really interesting film. Jackie Chan and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Are they antagonists or are they partners?
Arnold's the bad guy.
Oh.
Jackie Chan's the good guy. The preview, I'll just send you the preview. It's bonkers.
I mean, I'm just thinking of the difference in their sizes. It would just be hilarious to watch the fight. One of them is so tiny.
Well, the difference in size, but also Arnold's in his 70s. We think of him as an action star, But Arnold Schwarzenegger was never the most athletic guy. He was never doing backflips and stuff. His whole thing is he was just such a massive guy. So there's poor Arnold, his 70-year-old self, like taking swings at Jackie Chan, and it doesn't look like he's moving real well.
Of course, he's 70. I just still remember him from like things like Terminator. So, but of course, all this time has passed, and he is 70 now. I don't know if he did his own stunts in his films. Usually, did he use a stuntsman?
Arnold, no, he didn't. You've seen True Lies.
Yeah, yeah.
I think True Lies was a very good example of whenever he was doing anything particularly athletic. And I specifically remember him in a suit being very Arnold as James Bondish, sliding down a mountain, like firing while he's sliding down this snowy mountain on his back, and then doing a backward roll to get on his feet and running. And it was so obviously a stunt double because, again, not an athletic guy, just really big muscles and a charisma unique for a guy that size, where a lot of times bodybuilders are sort of off-putting, but he was still sort of handsome.
He's charming in his own way. He can be quite humorous. All right, so not athletic, but maybe better at punching and shooting.
Well, Terminator was so great because all he did as a Terminator is he just slowly walked down hallways. He was very Jason Voorhees, walking down the hallways, getting shot, and then him shooting the people that were shooting him because he was a Terminator.
He fitted that role so well as the Terminator. It's nuanced. Started by being just like Stone Cold, but you get more nuance as the films go on. So yeah, it's a very interesting offset with him against Jackie Chan. One is very athletic. He, creates all these kung fu moves as he is like improvising on set in each film. That's his style, using whatever surroundings there are, whatever things that are around him. One is like that. The other one is very charismatic, but very heavy duty.
Yeah, it's a thing of Jackie Chan sort of jumping around and kicking and moving and punching and moving, and Arnold just taking these big haymaker swings at him. Something similar done in a U.S. movie, the first Expendables, where he had Dolph Lundgren, who was just this massive hunk of human being fighting Jet Li. They were able to turn that into sort of an interesting action dynamic where Jet Li hopping and using the environment so he didn't get beat up by this guy that was twice his size.
It's definitely different styles of fighting you're getting there, according to the advantage of the fighters, whether they're lighter or they're heavier. The styles of fighting that are advantageous to how they're built. You get a lot of that in all sorts of different films. I mean, I'm thinking about when Danny Rand teaches Colleen Wing how to fight people who are twice her size in the Iron Fist TV series, thinking about how Black Widow fights, because there is this huge kind of difference very often between her and her opponents. Physically, I think that's partly why, that's what makes it so fantastic to watch. Different kind of styles of action.
I always liked it in, especially I want to say in the Captain America Winter Soldier, where you had Black Widow fighting. Scarlett Johansson is not a physically imposing woman. They were very smart in using a lot of moves that took advantage of the fact that she was smaller, more nimble, and more athletic, rather than the old Buffy the Vampire Slayer thing, where I know Sarah Michelle Gellar is 5'1" and weighs 85 pounds, but she's still, and they tweaked that, but because she had superpowers, but then having her punch bigger guys and knocking them out, that wouldn't have worked nearly as well if you had done it with Black Widow. Play into what her abilities and what she can do, and it was more interesting, especially when you compared it to, then you have Chris Evans as Captain America, who's this big muscle bound guy. He's going to show, hey, he fights one way and she fights the other.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to this employing of Western actors, there seems to be more and more of those in Chinese films now. We don't necessarily hear about them so much because those films are made in China and then released over there or in Asian markets. One film that I did think of is, so there's even a term for it, of the employing of Western actors in Chinese films. It's a sort of colloquial slang term. It's called buying mayonnaise. And then the other way, the Chinese actor stars cameoing in Western films or placing Chinese actors in Western films is called buying soy sauce, colloquially speaking. And I think of a very controversial film that has employed this practice, which is Zhang Yimou's The Great Wall with Matt Damon in it. I don't know if you saw that film.
I remember it, and nobody saw it. It did very poorly in the States, but I do remember that it was a weird movie because Matt Damon, he's a bankable A-list action star, but it was a sort of presented as like this historical fantasy film, and that's not really Matt Damon's bag. They promoted the heck out of it, and Matt Damon was on a pretty good part of his career, but people just didn't turn out for it in the States.
Oh, I think it did fairly well in Europe. There was so much controversy over this casting. They were talking about whitewashing. So it's interesting to hear that maybe people have a set image of Matt Damon, and they tend to see him in kind of more dramas rather than action films, perhaps, or maybe the Born Identity, sort of more thrillers and dramas than anything that's fantasy based, I guess. And that put me off. The conversations, the discussions, accusations of whitewashing put me off of the film for ages. But I finally saw it because some of my friends wanted to go to the cinema to see it, so I went to them. I went with them to see it, and after I've seen it, I don't think that really was the issue as much as people were saying, because he is a white actor in a Chinese film, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's whitewashing. And in fact, his character, he plays a kind of very mercenary kind of character, mercurial kind of character who wanted to steal gunpowder out of China to make some money, and he's then comes into contact with these people. He then comes into contact with these people, and he learns from them that that's a bad idea, because then there'd be more fighting and more wars and more people killed. So I don't think that's necessarily nobody. It's not like a Chinese person could have played this character,
Because he's basically playing the outsider and the person who doesn't understand the culture, and you give him a chance to learn the culture, learn and respect the culture. Only an outsider can do that.
Exactly, yes. Sort of like Forbidden Kingdom, for example. That film with Jackie Chan, but the protagonist is an American kid who ends up in the past and in this fantasy kind of, in historical China. So yeah, so he who ends up in a sort of fantasy version of historical China. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, so that kind of story is about adventuring into a world of the other, but you're seeing things through the eyes of a Western person, or in the case of the West, their own perspective. So that's the kind of narrative it is. And I think there were plenty of really cool Chinese characters in The Great Wall.
Well, does it become a thing where that was a big budget movie, and gosh, that came out in 2016? Oh wow, it wasn't as long as I thought it was. But you're doing a big budget movie, and a lot of Asian actors got work on that movie, and it may not have gotten made with that budget if you don't have a bankable star with Matt Damon. Now, I'm sure ideally the wish is that you had more Asian stars that were bankable and could lead a movie of that caliber with that budget in the States. And hopefully we get there. Hopefully Henry Golding or other actors are given the chance with movies like Snake Eyes and Shang-Chi, and we can get a point where the face of the poster doesn't have to be a white guy. The white guy could be the fifth name on the poster as that same character.
I agree, yes. The face on the poster doesn't have to be a white guy. The casting of Simu Liu is interesting. the issue some people had. Yeah, so he's a Canadian Chinese actor, not American Canadian, Canadian Chinese. The casting of that is very interesting because he isn't a very known face in cinema, but he's suitable for the role, and the casting, there is proper representation, cultural representation there. So I'm really excited about this film. I hope that it's very good.
You want it to be good. You want there to be more. You want there to be sequels to that, and you also want it to present opportunities to everyone else involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to I really hated how the Mandarin was done in the Iron Man film. Iron Man 3 it was, I think. But from the trailer, Tony Leung's Mandarin is excellent. I'm really looking forward to that too, because having cool villains as well as heroes is important.
Going back, you talked about the term for it, having these American actors come over, buying mayonnaise. Is there a particular case of it that you really remember where, oh my God, I can't believe they're in this, or maybe they were giving a great performance? It's like, oh, this is fantastic. Or one where you could sort of tell they were sort of sleepwalking through it. Because I think the criticism is, and especially with, I want to say, Bruce Willis, where Bruce Willis does these movies and they're low budget, and he's done, I think, at least one or two Chinese movies where he is showing up for the paycheck, he films for 2 days, walks off with the money, and it looks like he's sleepwalking his way through it. Are there cases of this that pop to mind?
Not really. I mean, you might have to help me out on this. The type of casting I can think of are in previous films, previous Chinese films, whether it's mainland or Hong Kong cinema, where just some random actor is employed. Not necessarily somebody very famous. Sometimes they're quite good. Sometimes they're just not very good. It's just because they are a Western face that they get cast in the Chinese films. I think it's better to have good actors in those roles, but if they're good actors, then they should be giving a good performance.
Some examples that I've heard of. What was it? Bruce Willis. What was the one he was? What was it? He was in a movie called Airstrike, and it was him and Fang Bingbing.
Oh, right. Okay. They love waving her in front of the screen.
And Fan Bingbing, who played Blink in X-Men Days of Future Past. Not a hugely featured role. I know there was some controversy with her, and I think Airstrike was supposed to get bigger release than it did, but there were some controversies, and I wouldn't dare address that because it didn't make huge news in the States, just enough that it sort of popped on my radar a little bit that she was having legal issues.
I think it was something to do with tax evasion. That's all as much as I know about it. But okay, so it didn't get released in China, did you say, or in the States?
Eventually, it was supposed to get a bigger release than it got. It finally got released in the States on like Blu-ray. It maybe got a pretty small release in China.
I mean, they could certainly have used her better in films. For example, in Iron Man, that Iron Man 3, she just walked on and off screen for a few seconds in a nice dress or something. And then in that X-Men film, she died very quickly, along with other people of color.
She's a beautiful actress with screen presence. And they made a little bit of a big deal that she got cast in X-Men Days of Future Past, sort of implying this was going to be her opportunity to like break through the American audience. The movie was very well liked. And then her role was such nothing. And it was just her staring a lot and she didn't even have very active powers. It was a lot of, she would point one direction and there'd be a portal open. So she didn't even get like to mix it up or punch or do cool action stuff.
Not a lot of lines, not a lot of dialogue either. Yeah. Well, we've been talking a lot about superhero films and kung fu films, and actually Chinese Asian actresses not a lot of them having that big break through these blockbusters. But actually the superhero form has existed in Chinese storytelling for ages, but in a very different format. But the essence is very similar. This loops back to the kung fu fantasies and kung fu films. In China, they exist more as swordsmen, these masters of kung fu who live by their own sort of code of honor. Some of them live in society, some of them choose to live outside of society. Most of them, very often hermits or eccentrics or recluses, but they. Oh, I'm sorry. It's my it's my email coming in. Let me just.
Your own transformer. You have a transformer in your room.
Yes, G1 transforming sound is the best. Yeah, I'm a big Transformers fan. That's another piece of American pop culture that was introduced into China in the G1 animation in the 80s, which I grew up watching, and of course I've looked at more subsequent stuff, but that's the starting point. That's the starting point. Let me shut my email down.
Who's your favorite character from that generation one of Transformers?
Favorite character? I think it would have to be Soundwave and Grimlock, because Grimlock is just this robot dinosaur. What's not to like about that?
It's every little kid. You're just robot dinosaur. You have them locked in at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's got a very distinctive personality. I mean, he sounds kind of dumb, but he's not really dumb. And he's a smart leader of the group. But he's also very brave and, very bold and decisive. I like the whole of the Dinobots, but Grimlock's my favorite. And then Soundwave. I mean, he just sounds so cool. He looks really cool. He looked really cool, and he can generate kitties on demand. So there's Ravage, and also the Laserbeak and Rumble and Frenzy as those cassette tapes. They just look so cool when they fly out of his chest.
Oh, that was always so cool. I was always waiting for him to hit that button and they would pop out.
My cat's named Ravage because of that.
Oh, really? That's great.
It's a black cat.
Transformers sort of leads into where with Transformers, and I want to say especially this, I want to say it was the second movie, they made a real point of having sort of an Asian influence and Asian plot lines in the movie to appeal to the Chinese audience. And they did the same thing with you mentioned before Iron Man 3, where the version of Iron Man 3 that showed in the States was somewhat different than the version that showed in China. Specifically, the doctor who performed the surgery on Tony at the end to remove the shrapnel from his chest was an Asian doctor. And the version of the film shown in China, that was a much more robust part. Do you have a sense, or can you give an idea of how those scenes and how that sort of placement is viewed by the Chinese audiences? And I know you can't speak for everyone, obviously, but if you have a general sense, is it viewed as sort of being, are they enjoyed, or is there a bit of eye rolling? It's like, oh, they're just putting this to try to appeal to us. Little do they know, we just want to see the movies. We just want big robots beating each other or Iron Man flying around.
I think it depends on how they do it, whether it's done well or not. I was studying in Beijing at the time, and I actually saw Iron Man 3 in the cinemas. There was that whole bit about Dr. Wu performing the surgery and making it very clear that Dr. Wu and the Chinese people are behind Tony Stark, that kind of thing. And they also tried to make the Mandarin, they were very, very particular about not making him a villain because they don't want to offend the Chinese. So they made him very not Chinese. So I've written about this. I've written about the Mandarin Iron Man 3 on my website. I'm fully aware that the Mandarin's origins and his portrayal in the Marvel comics was, he did begin life as a racial stereotype, with his sort of greenish skin, his villain's beard, and his long nails, and his supervillain abilities. So very much a sort of Fu Manchu in another format. But at the same time, stereotypes do emphasize the traits, certain cultural traits. I'm not saying I condone them, but on the other hand, making him un-Chinese is not a great way to go. I didn't think that was a great way to go. They kind of made him into this bad actor from Croydon, ineffectual and sort of like a crazy person you meet on the bus. Whereas in actual fact, the Mandarin he's physically very impressive. He's got great mental abilities as well as he wields great magic from his 10 rings. He's highly intelligent. He's a super arch villain. I don't think the Chinese were very impressed by that, by this portrayal of Mandarin.
In the comics, he at times was at a comparable level as Magneto and Doctor Doom.
Yeah, that's the sort of character he is. Yeah, exactly.
He was one of those super bad guys who won a lot. He wasn't a guy that would show up every 15 issues of Spider-Man and would get slapped around. He was a guy who was Tony's equal, was Iron Man's equal. You feel like, and hopefully this is what they'll correct with Shang-Chi, where, okay, get rid of the stuff that's really offensive, get rid of the stereotypical stuff, and get a cool, tough, smart, charismatic Asian actor to be, and this is something that they tried at times with some success to do in the Marvel comics, where instead of him showing up with the artist rendition of what he thinks Chinese garb would be and with kimonos and whatever, no, have him dressed in like a really nice looking suit and with a cool haircut and an astute businessman who could be Tony's equal on the battlefield and also in the boardroom. Try to do that instead of, all right, we're just going to take what was a cartoonish stereotype and we're going to twist it around a little and get Ben Kingsley to do it.
Not that Ben Kingsley is not a great actor, he is. It's just the role is problematic, the character design. Yes, exactly. Right now, the Chinese are very proud of their heritage in a way that they haven't been before, just because of how much output in the arts China is coming out with, and the standard has increased greatly. The Chinese are they would be impressed if filmmakers make an effort to nod to their culture, whether it's traditional or pop culture. But it has to be done in an appropriate way. They could have the character in a smart suit, the Chinese character in a smart suit. They could have him in a traditional robe, but if they do that version of him, then they need to have proper consultation with researchers and sensitivity advisors in order to get it right and not mix up the different East Asian cultures, like, not lump them all together, Korea, Japan, China. So I think Chinese audiences would be impressed if it's done properly.
You just reminded me, Margaret Cho had a TV show.
Yeah, she's incredibly funny. It's the comedian you're talking about, right?
Right. And in the 90s, they gave her a sitcom called All American Girl. She has expressed her own frustration with the program, but she was playing, I want to say, a Chinese American, and all of the actors in it, they were Korean, they were Asian. Like, they didn't even have the consistency of Chinese American actors playing the roles. And then it was also a show, the writers were white, the producers, everyone was Caucasian except for her. She was so sort of fresh into her career, and she was fighting her own battles because aside from not having the cultural backup with the writers or even her fellow cast members, and she said it's not that they were bad actors or anything, it was just sort of a sign of the problems with the show. Also, she was trying to fight a battle of having her culture properly on display, and then they also were trying to make her lose 40 pounds. She wasn't a Jennifer Aniston-esque thin actress, so fighting that is like, I'm a woman of size, trying to represent my culture in the way that I would feel would be appropriate. It's so hard. There's so many battles.
So that's double diversity issues, body diversity and racial representation. Did you say that was in the 90s?
Yeah, 94. It went from September 94 to March 95. It lasted one season. Kind of a funny show, but it was definitely a thing where Margaret Cho is a really, for lack of a better term, she's a really ballsy comedian with a dark side. That was a network TV show in the 90s. They weren't going to let her go too deep with that.
Well, maybe that's why it only ran for one season. I think people are a lot more culturally aware now. I would hope anyway. I mean, it's a lot more acceptable for diverse faces to appear on screen as main characters. Also, people are a lot more aware of names and words being introduced into English from other cultures as a thing of their own to describe the cultural phenomenon, whether it's food or art or anything, things like that. So they are more aware.
There seems to be very slow, but hopefully very deliberate and very effective movement in the right direction. As we're speaking today, they just released like a reunion special about the cast of Friends. And Friends was 6 all very, very, very white people, and they were all thin and they were all good looking. They lived in a city, a version of New York that had very little diversity. If that same show were to come out today, you could be pretty certain there would be actors of color, actors of different body size. Pretty much any show that comes on network TV, there seems to be an effort to be more inclusive with the casting. It helps. It gives more plot lines. It gives a more interesting dynamic to the show. So obviously, there's so much more to go. It shouldn't be news that Snake Eyes is going to have an Asian lead. It shouldn't be news that Marvel, they've had 20 plus movies and finally there's one with an Asian lead actor. But I guess we're seeing the results of some of the baby steps.
Yes, exactly. Jin Luan Yang, the writer, Chinese-American writer, he's done some great stuff in comics. So he was the writer of American-born Chinese, and also he created an American Chinese hero called the Shadow Hero. But he's now working with DC he's worked with DC on Superman. He's also published a mini series of Shang-Chi comics. So I know he's working with other people of color, artists and illustrators and writers on more comic stuff. So we need more people like him. So I'm talking about writers now, not really actors. On-screen faces are still more tricky because they have a lower denominator, I think, than creators. But certainly you're putting people in position of creative control, either in the director's chair or in the writer's place, where they can represent their own heritage, their cultures. That's always a great thing. It's always a great thing.
And also a great thing is having you on the show. This has been so amazing having you with us.
It's been amazing chatting to you. Where has all the time gone?
Gone fast. We want to have you back. Will you return?
Yes, absolutely. There's so much more to talk about.
There's so much more to talk about, and we want to have you back. Please plug your pluggables. Share where people can find out, read your writing, and get more of you.
I certainly will. Thank you. And I will obviously be telling people about this fantastic podcast.
Is there a website that people can check out or anywhere where they can go to read your writing?
Yeah, so my website is snowpavilion.co.uk. Snow as in the weather, and then pavilion as in the architectural construction, then .co.uk. That's my website, and it also has my social media. That's Instagram, Twitter, so they can connect with me through there. So I publish articles I work with various platforms and organizations to publish articles and do talks, but I also put up regular stuff on my own website on top of the book stuff. So there's plenty of things to read and see there.
Well, we recommend everyone check that out. This has been amazing. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.
Podcast, episode 236. Big thanks to Xueting Ni. I could have talked to her all day, and she will return. Also, big thanks to Katie. Another great question, and there are more where that came from. Next time on the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, musician Lydia Luce joins me to talk about her new album, Dark River. Till then, in the words of Jarf Hardin,
see you in the funny pages.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod, and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
I'm a woman of size.
Talking about the Chinese actually had something in their storytelling that's very similar to the comic superheroes. They're just in very different format, but very similar in essence. So they're essentially swordsmen who are masters of kung fu and often eccentrics or recluses and hermits. Some of them live among civilian society. A lot of them live away, as a hermit or recluse. So some of them live in civilian society. Some of them operate away from that. But during those crucial times, they intervene in society and essentially act as vigilantes to help the disadvantaged and to fight wars and to save the country, basically. They're not in spandex. They haven't got mutant powers or cool gadgets, but they do have these lovely flowing long robes, knives, swords, spears, and their power is a lot more chi-based, based on kung fu, but they're essentially very similar to comic superheroes. And I think that's one of the reasons why Marvel and DC and Dark Horse, for example, have done so well in China.
And there's sort of a symbiosis, like writers have for years have taken inspiration from those Chinese characters. I mean, what you're saying sounds a lot like, the more you described it, that just sounds like Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I know George Lucas took inspiration from Asian stories for Star Wars.
Yeah, he took a lot of inspiration in the world building of Star Wars from Asian cultures and around the world, really. So the Force has its similarities. The Jedi and the Siths, their wielding of the cosmic force has a lot of similarities to Qigong, which is the basis of, which is the manipulation of Qi. That's the basis of all Kung Fu. So yeah, immediately we're finding similarities there. Star Wars is an interesting crossover because it's fantasy. It has a lot of different cultural elements and not just Western.
It would have Westerns mixed with samurai tales mixed with whatever else was on George Lucas's shelf that day.
Because he was taking influence from so many places, that makes the story so great. All the different planets with different peoples. And also the other thing I wanted to say was that about following on from our discussion about Margaret Cho and her show in the 1990s. I mean, it's awful that she's had to deal with things like not having Asian American writers having comments about her body image, etc. But at least she got a show. She got her own show, and that was 30 years ago. And there's been certainly some improvement. And the show that I thought of was Fresh Off the Boat. I've just dipped into it, but that was from 2015 and about this Taiwanese, a family of Taiwanese immigrants in America. And that had, most of the actors were East Asian. So that immediately is a great improvement.
It helped make Randall Park a star, and Randall Park is sort of a buzzy actor, just his recent work on WandaVision, and people loved him on WandaVision.
Randall Park, which one is he?
He was in the second Ant-Man movie. He was the FBI agent who shows up and works with Monica.
Oh, Agent Wu. That's it. Oh, okay. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I just don't recognize him by his name. But yes, he was great in Fresh Off the Boat. And then I was really, really happy to see Rambo and Wu in that show, in WandaVision, which was all around the great show.
Love that show so much. And also from Fresh Off the Boat, Constance Wu, who has become a bit of a buzzy actress.
Right, exactly. After Crazy Rich Asian. And I think she's also done some voice acting I think she's done some voice acting as well for Chinese animation.
And she was in Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez. She's getting a lot of work. So much that she was actually ended up being a little irritable. When Fresh Off the Boat got renewed for its last season, she was actually expressed on social media being upset because she's had so many opportunities. And Fresh Off the Boat, as much as she seemed to have some affection for the show, but she wanted to be a movie star, and it's hard to blame her for that.
Oh, so she would rather do movies than TV. I mean, you kind of wish that some of these opportunities went to other Chinese or East Asian actors who maybe are not getting any opportunities. But yes, it's great that she can have the choice. She can comment like this because that should be the case for East Asian actors as well as others, that they can have a choice of what they want to do rather than just have to take whatever comes to them because there are so few.